Hey guys, so this is AP World History, Chapter 22, Transoceanic Encounters and Global Connections. All right, so today we are going to talk about exploration and the effects that exploration had not only in Europe but around the world and in the Americas as well, and the things that got diffused from one area of the world to the other. So, what you really need to know here is that there are three main motives for exploration. And the easiest way to say it is the three G's: God, glory, and gold. These are the reasons why we begin to see various countries begin to explore around the world. So, let's go ahead and get started. So, like I told you, the motives for exploration: God, glory, and gold. Portuguese explorers wanted to exploit new lands, and it really does start with the Portuguese. The Portuguese will be the first European explorers to want to, discover the world and discover what's out there. And in the beginning, it really starts with them wanting to find a faster route to the Asian markets. So voyages led to the establishment of plantations on more southerly Atlantic islands. Okay, as the Portuguese go and explore, they begin to kind of establish themselves in the southerly areas of the Atlantic. Another thing we see here was, like I said, to establish maritime trade routes to those Asian markets. That was the other reason for the motive to explore. They wanted to kind of get rid of the Muslim intermediaries, giving Europeans more profit. So what was happening is that they were going by land. They were trading by land kind of through the Silk Roads, but I mean, don't think that they were trading from Europe all the way into China. They were stopping in the middle in about Southwest Asia, and that's where they would pick up the silk or the porcelain, whatever they were getting from China. And what would happen is that these Muslims who had these goods, they would like hike up the prices on the Europeans. So for the Europeans, they felt, well, you know what, if we ourselves just find a direct route to the Asian markets, then we won't have to pay as much and we won't have to pay these Muslim intermediaries. So that was, that other reason, the other motivation to want to discover new routes. And they also felt that if we found these new routes, then we would get the glory, the idea of, getting the recognition for being the first to discover this route. So, like we said, it also looked for more direct access to the markets to, again, try to avoid Muslims. And then the last reason that people began to explore was the idea of God, that, Europeans, they felt, well, if we're going to go on these expeditions, then we should spread Christianity to the people that we meet. So the goal of expanding Christianity also motivated Europeans into the larger world. Persuasion or violence were ways of spreading the faith. So sometimes when they went to these lands, you were either going to convert one of two ways, either by the words that were being spoken to you by these missionaries, or you were going to be converting forcibly. Either way, you were going to be converting, was the point. So it just depended on how you reacted to it. So Prince Henry the Navigator, he promoted Christianity in Africa, and it really justified and reinforced the material motive, saying, you know what? Yes, we're going to go till we can, be famous for this, whatever we find new. Yes, we're going to go because we're trying to find a quicker way to the Asian market so we can make more money. But really behind it, we're going to go and spread God's message. So they use that as a justification to, explain why they were doing all the other material motives. So some of the things that helped them to explore these new areas were various technologies, such as the ships and the sails. So there were different types of sails, and that would allow for better forms of navigation. The ones that we see come up are the square sails and the triangular lateen sails. In terms of navigating itself and finding your direction, we saw the astrolabe, which would determine the latitude, and we saw the compass, which gives us direction. So these also helped in the exploration. And then, of course, also the knowledge of winds and currents and the Volta do Mar. So determining navigational possibilities. So learning how, the winds flowed in certain seasons and certain times, that helped to determine which way you were going to set out. They took advantage of prevailing winds and currents to sail almost any part of the earth. Once they were able to figure out those winds and currents, like I said, it made sailing around the world much easier. Something they used was the Volta del Mar, which was sailing around the contrary winds. So what they began to learn was that instead of going against the wind, even though it seemed a shorter route, it was much easier to go with the wind. Even though that may have seemed longer, in the end, it was actually much faster because it was kind of like the wind was pushing you. So that whole idea of the Volta del Mar made it faster, safer, and easier and more reliable form of exploration because you knew which direction you were going. So we all had very famous explorers during this time. One of the first ones was Prince Henry of Portugal. He went to the Moroccan ports of Ceuta, voyages down to West Africa. We also see somebody else, Bartholomew Diaz. So he will round the Cape of Good Hope and Indian Ocean and turn back around. So he'll go like all the way into the Indian Ocean and then he'll come back. Okay. And then the route to the Indian Ocean gave merchants opportunities to buy silk, spices, and peppers at the source. So this was, again, the whole reason why they wanted to was to get to these Asian markets. So once they were able to discover this, they began to, let others know of this other way to get there. Vasco da Gama, he will make it all the way into the Indian Ocean, into the Indian Ocean basin, and here he will establish the trading post in Calicut in the Indian Ocean basin. And it'll be one of the first European trading posts in India. So the English and Dutch will follow the Portuguese into the ocean basin after them. So just keep in mind that it really is Portugal that starts this exploration. And then once they realize that, hey, you know what? They are doing it. They are making it into the Indian Ocean. Then it's the English and the Dutch and everybody else who follows suit. Christopher Columbus, we looked at him in the previous chapter really quick, basically argued that sailing west would be closer and more profitable. That was his argument. He felt that, all right, we've discovered that if we go around Africa, then we'll make it that way. But in his head, he thought, you know what if we just go straight west and Asia should be right there. So he got sponsored by Italian bankers and Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. So he sailed under the Spanish flag, but it was Italian bankers that helped to fund his voyage. And on his voyage, he came across the Americas. Again, he didn't realize he was in the Americas. He thought he had actually made it to India. So when he saw the Native Americans there, he thought they were Indians per se. But, in reality, they were Native Americans. So one of the major, obviously the huge things that Columbus does was it establishes links between the eastern and western hemispheres, meaning that two worlds have now collided. We have now, discovered this new world because of this accidental, finding. And we begin to see conquest, settlement, and exploitation of that new world occurring. But it was because of Christopher Columbus and his sailing to the Americas. We also see Ferdinand Magellan and circumnavigation. So Ferdinand felt that Asian markets were closer to the west coast of the Americas. So he thought, okay, well, if this is the Americas, then Asia has to be really, really close. And so he will become the first to circumnavigate the world, meaning that he will go all the way around the world. He will sail all the way across the world. That's what circumnavigation is. Because he thinks that the Asian markets are just right there, that America's this small land. We also see that once they kind of figure out, hey, you know what, America is huge and there's this whole other side, we begin to see more exploration of the Pacific and people begin to chart the features of the Pacific and they realize, you know what, there's not much trade here. So as they're charting the Pacific, and what I mean by charting is like they're putting it on a map. They're identifying the smaller islands that are existing, just everything that exists in the Pacific. And they, like I said, begin to realize, well, you know what, it's not as lucrative as it would be to trade in the Indian Ocean basin. But English explorers searched for northwest passage from Europe to Asia while doing this. One of the more famous captains or explorers that did really go into the Pacific and investigate it was Captain James Cook. He led many expeditions through the Pacific, and during his time he had a lot of interaction with the Polynesian islands and peoples from Hawaii, Tahiti, and Tonga. So he's more known for really, really charting that area and learning about that culture. So as we see people from Spain, from England, from, the Dutch, who are making these new discoveries and these new explorations into these new areas for material benefit, for economic benefit. With this comes trade and conflict, okay, that begins to exist. So, Portuguese trading post and Alfonso de Albuquerque. So, Portuguese mariners didn't want to conquer territories, but to control trade routes by having others pay duties. So, their thing wasn't that they wanted to go in and take over land. Their thing was, you know what? This is what we're going to do. We're going to establish, that people have to pay a tax if they come into these ports, into these posts. So, Alfonso de Albuquerque wanted merchant ships to purchase safe conduct passes, pretty much saying this is your pass that allows you to come into this area, and that if you didn't have a pass, then they were going to take military action on you. Well, that was a huge lie. I mean, they did have military, but not to the extent where they could take on that kind of assault on another ship. So they didn't have enough forces to enforce those orders of not having safe passage. In addition, we also see the English and Dutch trading posts being established in these areas. They built trading posts on Asian coasts. The English focused mostly in India, and the Dutch in Cape Town and Southern Africa. So just in case, that's kind of explains a lot why some Indian people have like an English sounding accent. That's because of the colonization that occurred by the English there during these trading times. And that's why in South Africa, if you've noticed, some of them are, white. That's because of the Dutch that came and colonized there during this time. So the English and Dutch, they had an advantage in terms of sailing because their ships were faster, cheaper, and more powerful ships. So they could get to the areas faster, which means that they could make money faster. In addition to this, they also created something called joint stock companies. And essentially what these companies were a lot of or many different people got together and they invested in maybe a few ships. And these few ships would go out and do the trading. And the benefit to this was that not one person was risking all their money, that everybody was, putting in some money into this venture. And the good side to this was that because you put in money, you were also going to get money through the trading that was occurring on your ships. So the creation of these joint stock companies really helps to begin an entrance of what we see as just regular trading companies in general. And we see that with the development of the English East Indian Company and the United East Indian Company. So two different companies. I know they sound the same, but it's super important that you know who belongs to what country. So obviously the English East Indian Company, that belongs to Britain. And the United East Indian Company, also known as the VOC, that belongs to the Dutch. And these were really the two main trading companies at the time. They were like the powerhouse companies of this time of exploration. So the government support was there, but they are privately owned companies, which means that if they ran across any interference with the money they were making in certain lands, in certain ports, then the government would support them in taking military action against those people who were on those lands. So the government support, even though they're privately owned companies. And these charters that went out, they could buy, sell, build, and make war because they had that support of the government when they were going into these areas. And this was going to be, like I said, the onset of major trading companies, the early global network of trade that we'll continue to see from here on out. There's also European conquest in Southeast Asia as well. In terms of the Philippines, we see in 1565 Legazpi land in the Philippines, and it was really easy for him to take over this area because there was no central government, just kind of all these little chiefdoms that we see. So very easy for them to take over, and Spanish forces controlled the coastal regions of that land. In terms of Manila, this will become a multicultural port city, and it will be the hub of Spanish commercial activity. And of course, the goal was also to spread Christianity. In, most of these areas, especially with the Spanish, especially with French, their huge goal, they always have that big push for Christianity. The other companies like the East English Company and the Dutch Company, the VOC. Goal of Christianity was there, but it wasn't a huge push. They were more upfront about their motives, which was the money. In terms of the conquest of Java, that was controlled by Dutch mariners, and they wanted to control the spice trade in the area. So what you really, really need to know is that Southeast Asia had the spices. Okay, they had the spices. It's always going to be in Southeast Asia whenever you hear them talk about spice, Southeast Asia. So moving on into Russia, the Russian Empire in Asia, that area kind of got explored a little bit too. We see this with the encounters in Siberia. So Russian acquisition was in northeastern Eurasia, and the lucrative commodity here was fur. Everybody's going, sailing and setting up ports and everything. Well, with the Russians, they see that fur is something of value. And so what ends up happening is they go into Siberia, and Siberia has 26 major ethnic groups. And Russian adventurers in the beginning, when they go up to Siberia, they want tribute from these groups. And remember, tribute is like you're giving gifts or money to the people who are taking over you or conquering you. And some of these ethnic groups, they said, they refuse to do it. And so what ends up happening is that these groups get raided on and they get taken over and they become hostages. But as time moves on, they realize that these native people are actually helpful to the economic needs of the Russians, meaning that they know where the fur is. They know how to help them out to make money. So the Russian government will begin to see importance in these small people, as they call them, in these ethnic groups, and they will begin to protect them for their benefit. And they try to push Christianity on some of the indigenous people as well. So the Siberian occupation, pretty much those who lived in Siberia, if you were going to move up there, were social misfits, criminals of war, prisoners of war. That if you didn't see the natives up there or you didn't see people going for fur, that's what you saw. All right, so as you can see, there's a lot of trading, a lot of commercialism going on, and it's going to start to get real messy. And countries are going to start to fight against one another because of these rivalries. Because it's like, hey, you're in my land, well, I want that land too, so I'm willing to fight you because I feel I'm a stronger or better country than you are. So competition and conflict begin to exist. Dutch vessels are prominent in the Indian Ocean, and they control the spice trade, like I said. English and French were dominant carriers in the Indian Ocean as well. So commercial conflict led to conflict in the Caribbean and Americas. So pretty much what's happening is that, yeah, we're fighting over here in India, but this is going to push on into the Americas where we're at too. So there was constant fighting in the areas. And this will eventually lead to the 7 Years' War. And this was a global conflict. Not probably, but the first global conflict in history. All right. And it was in places like Europe, India, Caribbean, North America. All these places were a part of the 7 Years' War because the same countries were all colonizing these areas. So it laid the foundation for 150 years of British imperial hegemony. Britain will be one of the major players in this war, and they will fight against the French. It'll be like Britain and Prussia against France and Spain, okay? And Britain is just much larger. And when they win the 7 Years' War, it's pretty much saying we are the new world power. We are the first world superpower. All right, and it'll last for about 150 years. And this conflict with the 7 Years' War will merge with the conflict during the French and Indian War in America. So the French and Indian War was another war that France was fighting against the British, but in this one, they had the Native Americans were taking sides, like some were on the British side, some were on the French side. So it was like a war within a war with the French and Indian War. But again, the 7 Years' War pretty much said at the end, Britain is going to win out, and they will begin to show hegemony, like total control of an area. And Britain will begin to take over areas all over the world, India, Canada, and Caribbean. And there's a saying that during this time and into the 1800s that the sun never set on the British flag. And that's because if you look at this map, every area at some point in the world was controlled by the British. So that's why it said the sun technically would never set on the British flag because of the areas that they were in. All right, so the last thing we're going to look at are the ecological exchanges that exist, because you can't just think like, oh, we just came into a new land and we're going to keep to ourselves and everything's good. No, that's not what happened. There were obviously lots of diffusions going on. So probably the most important one that you need to know, and you need to know the name, is the Columbian Exchange. All right, and this was global diffusion of plants, crops, animals, human population, and disease pathogens. And this is probably one of the best examples of it. So as they discovered the New World, they are bringing back goods from the New World into Europe, Africa, Asia, into the Old World. The Old World is over here, Europe, Africa, Asia. The New World was considered North America, South America, all right? And that's because it was new. They'd never known about it. In the Old World, they've been traveling it for so long. So they bring goods back over here, and then vice versa. The Old World will take goods into the New World. So the biological exchanges altered the world's human geography and natural environment. Diseases brought a sharp demographic loss to indigenous peoples, especially in the Americas. The Europeans, they came with all kinds of diseases like typhus, measles, smallpox, diphtheria, whooping cough. These were all diseases that the natives in the Americas never experienced before. So it killed a lot of them off. And but that was a part of the exchange, an unintentional effect of the exchange. Epidemics, diseases, like I said, they were going to destroy societies, and it was probably up until this point in world history the worst demographic calamity the world had ever seen. It killed about 100 million people, okay? So it was huge. A lot of negativity we see with the Columbian Exchange, a lot of negative stuff happening with the killing of people, the diseases brought in. However, there were also good things that happened. This is just telling you about Eurasia. To the west, they were bringing in white rice, sugar, bananas, apples, cherries, peaches. Europe to the west, dairies, horses, cattle. Americas to Eurasia, Europe and Africa, maize, potatoes, beans, and peppers. So all these things here, these are going to the Old World, and then these are the New World going to the Old World. So still with the Columbian Exchange, like I said, plants and animals fueled a surge in world population. So even though we do see this major population decrease, actually there was a population increase over a longer period of time that helped because they brought nutritional value from the new foods that they were receiving. And it also spread the human populations voluntarily and involuntarily. So meaning that more people were coming into the Americas because they were colonizing the lands, but at the same time, involuntarily, because slaves are being brought into the Americas to work in the labor systems there. So we see both, again, positive and negative effects of human migration existing. And we also see the development of the triangular trade. Some of you may have heard of this, but this is an example of it. It makes a triangle. So what's happening is that North America here is exporting its raw materials like lumber, metals, tobacco, and they're sending it to Europe, okay? And in Europe, they begin to make manufactured goods. And what Europe's going to do with these manufactured goods is, one, they're going to sell them back to the colonies here for purchase. And then two, they're also going to sell them to Africa. They'll sell them guns, clothing, iron, beer to Africa in exchange for the slaves. And what they'll do is the slaves will go into the Americas to work in these labor systems. All right, and so that's what makes the triangular trade. Raw materials come up again to Europe. Manufactured goods go back to some to North America. Some to the Americas, and then to Africa. Africa down here will exchange those manufactured goods for slaves. The slaves will go to the labor systems in the Americas. So that is the triangular trade. Transoceanic trade, emergence of global trading system, like I just mentioned. We also see the Manila galleons, the Manila and Philippines and Acapulco on the west coast. So these galleons were larger ships that could carry larger cargo. and there's exchanges between Mexico and Asia that are also existing. In terms of environmental effects of global trade, many animals, because they were exploiting them, will come close to extinction. The world became exploited by humans for its natural and agricultural resources. So this is a time of great discovery, but it's also a time where we are, doing a detriment to our world because we are just exploiting the resources that are there. And this will continue and continue and continue. All right, so that is chapter 22. And just keep in mind how the world is now, we're pretty much all united with this exploration. And from here on out, our lives are going to be intertwined. All right, we'll see you guys next time.